Okay, so
Okay, amazing. So we are gone live. Um, Thank you to anyone who is joining us today. We're super excited to be bringing another event to our remote working series. So my name is Michaela. I'm the campus manager here at Talent Garden, and we launched the remote working series to talk to the different type of members that we've seen join our co-working space. So we started with our first episode on co-working, then we moved on to professional parents, and today we're really excited to be talking to Lauren, who is a recent graduate who transitioned into a remote role thinking it was going to be fully in person. So I'm really happy to be here today with Lauren. And Lauren, maybe you want to kick us off with an intro from yourself, um, your course, and how you entered your remote role.
yeah, absolutely. So I studied in TUD. I did marketing course there for 4 years, which was great experience. If anybody is interested in marketing, that is definitely the place to go. So I graduated in 2019 and I was searching for some jobs in that area for a while. And I reached Talent Garden just before the pandemic. I've been here for just over a year now. So I joined on March 9th. I had 1 week here and then I was straight into remote working, straight to working from home. Um, Lucky me. Yeah. And I suppose if I look throughout college, I had always worked in the library, or even for my leaving cert, I worked in the library always because I just work better in an open environment where I can see other people working and it makes me want to be more productive. So working at home was something just completely new to me.
No, I can completely understand that. Obviously, I'm a bit biased as someone who runs a co-working space, but I get such energy from seeing the people around me work. It keeps
Yeah.
me motivated. I found when I transitioned into remote working, I also like struggled with just being alone in my apartment
Mhm.
and not having other people around me who are also working. So I want to ask, what what were the first few like weeks like for you adapting to a remote role?
So at the beginning, I actually didn't think it would phase me too much, especially as nobody really predicted that restrictions would last so long. I think we thought 2 or 3 weeks. And I suppose starting the new job, I thought, okay,
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna put all the skills I have into use, and everything's gonna fit into place in 2 weeks. And when I started onboarding, I learned about the work environment, projects I'm going to do, navigating the culture of a new company. But all of these are so much harder when you don't have, proper human interaction. And in marketing, I have to portray the brand when I'm working in communications, any kind of social media. And I wasn't physically in the workplace to do that. So I kind of had to find my way through making the time to analyze our brand toolkits, our old social media posts. I really went all the way back into the history of Salad Garden and kind of have to find our brand meaning from there. And as you were saying, Michaela, how you were in your apartment for a while on your own. Actually, for about, I'd say about a week or two after, it was hard to kind of avoid feeling burnout or any kind of isolation. I didn't know my team too well. I was new to the job. This was my first job out of college. And, I kind of felt this anxiety and a bit of solitude, as everybody has during lockdown. That's just kind of stemmed from feeling isolated while working from home or no company. Even with my family, I would go down and join them for a while, and they say, "How's work?" And I'm thinking, "Oh, it's just upstairs. I can't get away from it." I learned during college that, working, I just prefer working somewhere where there's a bit of a buzz. Yeah. I think people get it mixed up sometimes as well that remote working doesn't specifically equate to working from home. And that's why we got so lucky in June that I was actually able to
Hmm.
come to the co-working space. As and as I was returning, so were many other members. Everybody was just so happy to get out of the house. It's funny enough, I feel like people become so introverted in lockdown, but also so extroverted in the way that I want to join everything, every event, everything to have people around me. And then when it comes to meeting up with people, you kind of go, "How are you?" And there's no more really conversation to that, because everybody's been going through the same thing. But it was even just chatting to people in the cafe, or if one person from my team was in at that time. I think what's really great for graduates that are kind of remote working, and if they choose somewhere like a co-working space, you kind of get that little bit of reassurance, that you're doing your job right, or other people are in the same boat as you. Um, so that's been really, really helpful. But it did take a while to adapt. The first few weeks were very kind of up and down.
Yeah, of course. And you know what? It was a couple of weeks where not only was it up and down because you were starting a new role remotely, but also we were dealing with the whole impact of the pandemic, and no one knew what they were dealing with at that time. What I
Mm,
think is super interesting that you touched on is when you're starting in a new role in your first position and you don't know your company well yet, and you don't
mhm,
know your team, it can be really hard to develop those relationships that you need to work in a high performance team. It can be harder to understand the kind of day to day movements of the company, how work gets done. So, my question for you is, thinking back over those first couple of weeks or your first couple of months, how did you combat that? How did you work with Talent Garden to make sure you were getting to know the team, you were getting to
mhm.
know your managers, and that you still had those relationships even if they were largely virtual?
Absolutely. So I suppose, as you were mentioning, organizational culture is really big in a high performing job. And it's not something that you can read from in a book, it's something that experience comes from. But then, the big communication, that's when that comes in. I had to kind of identify, okay, how can I connect with people? Um, you know, it's I had to kind of set up some video calls. I did a one-to-one with everybody. I'm sure they were like, "Why is she calling me again?" But I just need to get to know everybody, find out a little bit more about their role, a little bit more about what they're like, how they're doing in the job. I think it also depends on what kind of team you're working with. On the one hand, I work with a marketing team, and then on the other hand, I work with a local team who all have different kind of jobs, and I'm the sole marketer on this team. So you're gonna have a lot of kind of different personalities and people with different kind of priorities. And that's why you kind of have to take the initiative and put yourself out there. What I made sure to do was have these one-to-ones, make sure that I could talk about things that weren't really to do with work. And I find that after doing that, you always find that one person that you can go to if you need help. A person that writes back to you a little faster than
Hmm.
everybody else, and knows a little bit more about the company or how long they've been there. So really it was a big bit of communication. And I think it's really important to kind of avoid miscommunication those first weeks. you know, Nobody really knows what you're working on
Hmm.
fully. We don't have that whole watchful eye over us anymore. And I think it kind of comes down to choosing the right methods of contact. So if I have a quick question or something that I want to talk to the member of the team about, I'll drop them a message on Slack. But if there's something that I think, okay, I'm going to need to refer back to this later, I'll send it over an email. And sometimes things can get lost in communication. That's when, setting up a full meeting or a phone call is just essential in those situations. So I think, it's being very clear, getting to know your team, and, making sure you're interacting with them right, because everybody is going to have their whole, different priorities at times. So I think it's really important.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right on that, Lauren. And I know that, like, when I started my first role, even in person, I was like, oh, I don't know if I can ask that question, or I don't want
Yeah,
to take that person's time. And
yeah,
I think when you're starting a remote role, you have to really put yourself out there. You have to make
yeah.
sure that you develop those relationships
Hmm.
through Slack messages, emails, calls, whatever it's going to be. Don't be afraid to reach out and make those connections, because when you are working remotely, it's harder to learn these things. And you do need
Hmm.
dedicated time in the calendar, because you can't hear what's going around by just sitting at the same desk. So you
Yeah,
have to be that little bit more proactive in ensuring that you're getting that one-to-one time with your manager, that they know what you're working
yeah,
on, to make sure that everything is visible and you're moving in the right path.
exactly.
Okay, so I suppose another really interesting question would be, you obviously work kind of blended at the moment. You do a lot of
Hmm.
remote, but you're also on campus every now and again. And for for someone who's looking to enter the workforce soon, what are the biggest differences you see? Do you see in joining a remote team versus joining a team that plans to be in the office when restrictions have eased? Because the option is now there to join a fully remote
Yeah.
team. And I think it's really important to understand what that means before signing up for a company or joining this team. So, what are the biggest differences that you see?
I would definitely see, if we're working in a team-based environment, if I'm thinking of a graduate who's just come out of college, we have fully settled in college. I was working with people I knew very well, and I knew every day for about 4 years. We would team up on a project and we would go, okay, um, I know what I'm going to do. I know this part I'm going to do. And suddenly you're meeting people virtually. It can be a little more difficult. But I do think the blended way of working is the best way to go. You can definitely cater your tasks to whether you're going to be on campus that day or whether you're going to be home. Even in Talent Garden, I've noticed that we have some actual students that come in, people that are going for job interviews. There's, a really wide variety of people in co-working spaces right now. Um, and I suppose you do have to kind of weigh the pros and cons of both, but there is definitely the way to work around that. And it's great, I think, now that we have a choice. Um, so, now that it's law that you can choose to remote work or work from home, it's a really great development because we've all been kind of put into this position. But I do think, we've heard of the new normal, and I think that has different meanings to everybody. I think, after the pandemic, I was so used to just rolling out of bed and onto my laptop. But I find, anyways, from a blended way of working, that, co working spaces kind of create that little work life balance that we strive for. Even the commute in the morning gets me up, ready to go,
Mm-hmm.
feeling like a little bit of normality. And then there are also some days where I think, you know what, I have a little bit more work to do. I'm going to start a little bit earlier. So I'm going to work from home today. Um, I really think the blended way or hybrid working is the way to go forward. But I think for graduates, it might actually just be a lot of trial and error. And I think employers need to
Mm-hmm.
know that as well. There's a lot of change management that comes around when a graduate is coming into their first job. not only are they going from, college to their first job, but they're going from a traditional way of working to this new normal that's really not so normal quite yet. So yeah.
I think that's a really interesting point, that it's very hard to know if you're going to enjoy remote working or if you prefer in-person working until
Yeah.
you've trialed it.
Hmm.
Sometimes it depends on the type of work that you've got going on. Sometimes it depends on the type of home environment that you have set up.
Yeah.
I know that you mentioned you really like the freedom to choose based on
Hmm.
what your week is looking like, what your meetings are looking like. And I think that's a really important element of it. Remote working is not, we have to work from home. Remote working is,
Hmm.
I have the freedom to choose the best working environment for me.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could shed some light on what your typical day working from home and like the type of tasks you find better to do in a remote environment in comparison to being in with your team.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So I suppose if I'm working from home, I find my dedicated workspace and I do not move from that. To be honest, I think finding your own space, and leaving it at that is
Mm-hmm.
brilliant. It brings in a little bit of separation. Make sure it's not in your bedroom. It's really not the best way to go. But I suppose if I'm working from home, I think it's one of those days where I need to have complete focus on something. So if I'm doing a report or a really
Mm-hmm.
big project, blog, something like that, that I need to not have anybody around me for chat. Um, that's what I would usually do when I'm working from home. And you know what? It at the start it was so difficult because I have my phone beside me. Someone in my family's home, I'll go down and talk to them. But this is the trial and error, and you have to, find a way of kind of getting used to that. But I would say if I have more meetings someday, then that's when the co-working space is great, um, because it's more professional. If you're meeting with clients, you are kind of in the headspace, ready to go, prepared for a meeting. Um, as much as, if I'm working
Mm-hmm.
more so alone, I'd rather do it working from home.
Very good. So tell me, if you were to give one main piece of advice to yourself 12 months ago at this stage, entering a remote role, or anyone who's looking to enter a remote role, what type of advice would you give?
I would say, to be honest, autonomy is great, and going in and thinking, I know how to do everything, it is great, but it just should be expected. I think we've learned in the past year that everything is so unpredictable. We don't know how things are going to go. You need to reward yourself and allow yourself time to understand something. And I think it's a great tip for employers too. As I said, we've graduated in such an unpredictable time. We're doing a new normal kind of thing. I have a boss, but I haven't actually physically met him or her before. Um, so I really, really think understanding where you are, that you're not the same as the other, marketing executive who's been here for 2 years. You need to remember where your place is and stay positive from there. And as well from that, that you need to have a lot of self initiative. When you're in an office environment, you're going to be,
Mm-hmm.
it's so much more likely that you're going to have casual conversations with your colleagues. And now you've kind of got to make the effort to have a little back and forth with them. And, when you get along with your colleagues, when you know them a little bit more, you actually come to understand your role a little bit more too. Um, which I think is just great. That's exactly what you need. I think you need to allow yourself the time to settle in. I know when I came in, I expected the 2 weeks and I will be sorted. The training is over. I will know exactly what to do. And my 9 till 5 will be fully booked. And, I won't have to ask anybody questions. I'll just pop in every once in a while and say hi. And it's just not the way it goes. So be a little bit realistic and make sure to reward yourself, definitely.
I think that's really good advice. I think we all have this notion. I certainly did when I started in Talent Garden, not even remotely in person, that it would take, a couple of weeks and then I'd be totally up to the level of everyone else and I'd understand the nuances and I'd be able to work completely independently. And the reality of that is that it takes a very long time to settle into a role and understand an
Mhm.
organization and understand the role that you play is part of the bigger
Yeah.
picture. And it's definitely more of a challenge remotely because you're not getting all of these softer communications between meetings. You're not mixing with the team as much. But
Mhm.
another thing that you said there that I think is worth highlighting is that there's also more of a responsibility from the employer side. And whether or
100%.
not you start a remote role and really enjoy the experience or find it really difficult can sometimes be up to how the employer frames it.
Yeah.
I fault no one in the first couple of months of the pandemic for not having a remote onboarding process and strategy because we were in a whole different world and no
Yeah.
one knew what was happening. But I think for anyone looking to enter a remote role at the moment, you should be really looking for what the employer is doing to make sure that it's as easy and as seamless as possible. Your devices
Yeah.
should be sent to you. You should have, they should be making sure you have a good setup working from home where your chair is ergonomic, where your laptop is at the right height. They
Mhm.
should have the onboarding sessions and the one to ones scheduled into your calendar and really show that there is that extra level of support when they're trying to do something that's much easier done in person. So I think it's also, you obviously have a responsibility to make sure that you're fully engaged with the company and
Yeah.
you're trying your best in a remote environment, but you have to
Mhm.
be met halfway by the company.
Exactly. Yeah, no, exactly. And I think we're seeing so many companies now that are, you know, um, employing people fully remote and with no chance of going back to the office, or, they've kind of closed down their
Mm-hmm.
office and say, okay, well, you're working from home now. We'll give you some of what you need. And that's when we're at this point now where you really do have to put in your effort with employees, and especially people that haven't had the real life experience yet of working in their new kind of chosen career path. um but there is some
Mm-hmm.
responsibility on the employer as well, which is why I think you should reward yourself a little bit with how much you've done, because
Mm-hmm.
as I said, you have to put yourself forward a lot, and that can seem sometimes difficult, but you do need to be met halfway, definitely.
Absolutely. I think for if you've been working in a professional environment for 10 or 15 years, you know
Mhm.
what's normal and what's expected and what you can ask for and how you should operate. And that gives you a
Mhm.
lot of confidence, especially when you're going into a remote role. But when you're a fresh graduate and you're entering the workforce for the first time, these are things that you don't know yet and you have to learn. So it does require your company taking that extra little bit of care of you, also
Yeah.
you being that extra bit more confident and bold and reaching out and asking for things, which can be really difficult in your first role. So I definitely think you should reward yourself. I think anyone who
Mhm.
starts their first job remotely is really learning so much from that whole process,
Mhm. Yeah.
and definitely deserves a moment to celebrate it.
Yeah.
So now
Definitely.
that you have had the experience of remote working, you've had the experience of working from campus, from a co working space,
Mhm.
what do you think is the ideal working environment for a remote worker?
Mhm. Well, I would definitely say co-working would be for me, and I know that sounds a little bit more biased, but I suppose a kind of a
Tiny
flexible
bit
way.
biased.
Way. But I would say, I think, with co-working spaces, there has been, before this, you would be more likely to sign a contract for pretty much quite a long time, 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, whichever. And, I think we've really progressed since then, where we kind of have a little more flexibility, which is brilliant. As I said, I do prefer like the blended way of working, but I like to have that option that I can leave the house if I wanted too much, because even if there's just sometimes too much noise, this or that, um, or I really need to double down on something, I know that I have the choice to go, which is
Hmm.
brilliant. Um, and I think it's when I look at co-working before I even joined, I thought, okay, well, it's entrepreneurs and freelancers, and I don't know, how much am I going to get out of that, out of someone that started a business? I'm gonna just be an employee really here, so what can I do? But if I look at Talent Garden now, we've got writers, we've got coders, creatives, game developers, you name it, that are taking advantage of co-working spaces, and even say customer service agents, salespeople, anybody in digital and tech industry are really taking advantage of co-working. So I actually think it is the perfect time for employees or anything of a major company to be able to kind of have the choice and the option to work from a co-working space, even if it is from time to time. I think working from home and the co-working space, it's really easy to kind of adapt to working in a professional kind of environment then. But yeah, that would be my kind of ideal, bit of both.
Hmm. Hmm. I think it's an interesting point about co-working spaces because our job is to understand what is the like perfect working environment. That's what we spend a lot of our time here in Talent Garden trying to understand. And there's so many different things that are so important to making sure you have a productive work environment.
Mhm.
Yes, your table, your chairs, your laptop, all of that. But you need natural light, you need high levels of oxygen. The studies
Mhm.
that show you're supposed to have one plant per every three people in an office space, and it increases productivity by 33%. Like there's all these different elements that come into having a productive environment.
Yeah.
And I think so many people are working from their kitchen table, or they're working from, I was talking to someone today who said they know someone who was working from the top of a suitcase for a little while because they didn't have a desk in their apartment. And these type of things are not only like a physical inconvenience, but they do affect your work output and your
Yeah,
productivity. And like I
100%.
see the smiles on people's faces when they can come back into Talent Garden and they have
Mhm.
really productive days because they've changed their environment. The space is set up for productivity. And as you said, there's that little bit of a social interaction as
Yeah.
well. You know, when you're working in an office space, you're talking to people every 20, 30 minutes. You might be moving around. And then
Yeah.
I find when I'm working from home, I expect myself to be sitting at my desk for 4 hours straight, consistently being productive.
Yeah.
And it's not true. It's not how we're meant to work. So I think being in a social environment allows you to have those natural breaks. And when you're
Yeah.
working from home, sometimes it can feel like you have to have a full 8 hours of productivity, which
Yeah.
is really hard. It's a lot of pressure to put on yourself. So I think you have to be mindful of that when you're working from home as well.
Yeah. Absolutely. No, absolutely. I think it's that whole thing of, well, is not having that your boss watching over your shoulder, that you're like, okay, well, I have to discipline myself, so I can't take this break. I have to just keep going
Hmm.
and going. It is exactly as you were saying, Michaela, it's feeling like you have to keep going for 4 hours at your desk when it's really just not possible, and you're probably not really doing much meaningful work that way. If I were working from home, as I
Hmm.
said, I'm going to make sure I have a specific task to do for that day, and have, that is my goal to have done. But, really giving yourself a time limit, or well, then I need to spend the whole 8.5 hours doing that. It's just not really possible. And I do like to see that in a co-working space. I like to see a long queue at the cafe, or people going outside on their lunch when we get a rare sunny day. It's nice. I don't know. Sometimes I think, okay, well, if they can do it, so can I. I'll let myself.
Exactly. So, Lauren, I just have one more question for you. We've been talking pretty much nonstop for 30 minutes, but it's been a really enjoyable conversation. I have a question for you to finish us off. And then,
Mhm.
if anyone is connected to our live and has any questions, I think you can just pop them into the comment box, whether it be on Facebook or on YouTube, and it will come straight to us and we can answer them here on the event. So, I suppose my last question to round it all up, we've talked a lot about your experience, how it felt for you, what's the ideal working environment, and if you could summarize into like maybe three top tips for graduates entering a remote role, what would be your three main takeaways or main tips for them?
Okay. Well, I suppose, okay, that you are going to have to put in extra effort to stay motivated, not only for yourself, but with your colleagues. The extra effort can come in terms of taking a little extra time to do a bit of research into the company, or learning more about your role, or a little bit more about your colleagues. There's going to be a little bit more of a push there, not only because you're coming into your first like your first professional job, but because it is going to be remote for who knows how long. And I suppose the second is that settling in depends on you and your employer. We've got to, meet them halfway. Giving and receiving feedback is a really, really big part of settling into work and being able to do your role well. Having one to ones, whether it's about work or not. But, sometimes we can be so stuck in a task that we're doing that we don't realize that we might actually be overlapping with something that your boss is doing, or you might not have shared to your boss that this is something that you want to work on, and you two can have both completely different ideas of what the role is about. So I think keeping that kind of clear form of communication, that clear effort from both parties is super, super important. So I think graduates, as well as putting in the effort, I think you should expect effort back from the companies, you know. And I suppose third, I would say keep track of your accomplishments through the first, few months of your job. I'd say about 3 months you look in there and you think, oh my God, how have I done this much so far? Or you go, well, maybe not, I haven't finished one big project, but there are so many little things that you don't really notice you accomplish each week. So I think it's really, really important for graduates to recognize mini victories, whether it's literally getting like 20 new followers in a week, or posting a new blog and somebody said well done, and that can sound so silly, but it really is a mini victory for you, and it's something that, starting in a remote role and it being maybe a little bit more difficult, um, it's something that you could pull yourself out of. So yeah, I'd say those would probably be my top three now.
They are really, really good pieces of advice. And I think even for me, who's not a recent grad and thankfully not in a remote role right now, keeping track of your accomplishments and taking time to celebrate them is valuable advice for everyone, especially when you're working remotely and you don't have like the whole team being like, oh wow, that was really cool. Instead, you just get like a thumbs up on a Slack message. So I think they're three really strong pieces of advice. Well, great. Lauren, thank you so much for taking the time today to talk to me, to answer the questions that I have. I hope anyone who connected to our live really enjoyed it. I found it really informative. Lauren, it will be saved and it can be seen, I think, on our Facebook and our YouTube if anyone has missed out on it. And there'll be some follow-up information sent if anyone wants to reach out to Talent Garden to find out more.
Great. Thanks, everybody.